Just a week before the summit where climate change is high on the agenda, the Canadian government bought a pipeline.
Our government's position is clear. It must be built, and it will be built.
Well before the $4.5 billion investment in the Trans Mountain project, there was a blunt message from world-renowned economist Jeffrey Sachs.
No more pipelines. We don't want your stuff.
Sachs says the world's dependence on fossil fuels threatens our very survival, and governments worldwide need to make significant long-term change in their economies to offset the harmful effects of climate change and carbon-intensive development.
We know that to achieve the goal set in the Paris Climate Agreement, staying well below 2 degrees Celsius and warming, we have to shift to a zero-carbon energy system by the middle of this century. In other words, moving from coal, oil, and gas to wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, and nuclear energy, and some biomass also where it can be used sustainably, so that we're not emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We have to phase out of the fossil fuels and move decisively to a zero carbon power generation system, and then electrification of transport, electric vehicles, for example, or intercity rail and other technologies.
Sachs reacted to the pipeline purchase, calling it ham-fisted. He says that while Canada is taking steps towards renewable energy, there is still huge untapped potential in the areas of hydropower, geothermal, wind, and solar energy.
Canada could move to all renewable, and it could become an export power of renewable energy. I'm hoping in my part of the United States, the U.S. Northeast, that we could be importing a lot of Canadian wind and hydropower, which Canada could export on net to the U.S. All very, very important.
What's more, Sachs says, Canada is still in a position to harness global cooperation on climate change.
I would like to see the G7 rededicate itself to sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals. I'd like to see the G7 pledge to honor the Paris Climate Agreement. I'd like the G7 to have Mr. Trump declare, well, on further consideration and consultation with our major partners, the United States will not pull out of Paris. That was politics locally, he could acknowledge, not sensible policy. So the G7 should play that constructive role. Prime Minister Trudeau is world respected. His voice matters a lot. Canada matters a lot in this context. And the position needs to be very clear and very strong that we're for planetary survival, we're for sustainable development, we're for fairness, and we're going to move beyond the very local and very short-term politics.
Canada and the G7 countries signed onto the Paris Agreement on Climate, which came into effect on November 4, 2016. Here's where the countries stand on meeting their goals. Canada, reduce emissions by 30% from 2005 levels by 2030. It will be almost 4% short of its goal. France was to reduce its emissions by 40%. It will be 11% short. Germany will not meet its 2020 climate goals and has no current plan to keep itself on track for its 2030 goals of reducing emissions by 55%. Italy's goal is to reduce its emissions by 40% by 2030. It projects only a 24% decrease. Japan needs to reduce emissions by 25% by 2030 and is projecting a reduction of 22.75%. The UK says it will likely meet its commitment to the Paris Agreement and is projecting a reduction of 52% by 2030. The U.S. President Trump has said the U.S. will pull out of the Paris Agreement, and the country has not submitted any reports on its goals to the UN in 2017.